finish this thing off with the New York Jets and their 2023 fantasy projections. We saw some strides out of the Jets last year. And I mean, obviously any analysis you're going to do of them last year is going to be with Wilson and without Wilson. There's also some other with or without things that were going on. Obviously, Breece Hall looked like a world beater until he was gone. So that's kind of a what if. And of course, I mean, we brought in, and there's so many question marks here. We bring in Aaron Rodgers, and there's so many question marks about Aaron Rodgers.
How do you not lead off with that one? I mean, Breece Hall is great, but Aaron Rodgers is a ride.
The reason I didn't lead off with that is because I feel like when you're talking about the Jets 2023, you have to talk about their 2022 because we got a lot of we got some data points to look at. Like we learned that their quarterback was terrible, just awful. We learned that they had something in this running back. And now we're bringing in a quarterback where, I mean, his range as far as where he could perform this year is probably about as wide of a range as any quarterback in the NFL, at least that comes to mind. If you told me that this guy was going to be a top 3 quarterback in the league, I could be like, okay, I believe that. He's Aaron Rodgers. If you told me he was going to suck ass, I'd be like, yeah, of course.
It's Aaron Rodgers.
This has been coming for a little while now. So anyway, dive into these guys.
Yeah, let's look at it. It is going to be all new here, but we do actually have some interesting data to dive into. The fact that Rodgers is reuniting with Nathaniel Hackett, we had 3 years of these guys together. So I'm going to be projecting a lot based on that. If you look at the 2022
Nathaniel Hackett, the worst coach in the NFL last year?
Yes, exactly.
Just making sure we were talking about the same guy.
The biggest dumbass in the NFL, 100%, yes. For whatever reason, he got hired to be their offensive coordinator. I loved LaFleur, the guy that they moved out. Where Rodgers comes from, it's actually his younger brother, Mike LaFleur. He went to the Rams. I think they got a huge get by getting his mind there. I think LaFleur was not the issue at all. It certainly was a Zach Wilson issue. But, hey, they replaced him with Hackett, the biggest bonehead in the league. So let's see how that will shake out. When he played with Rodgers, though, these two actually did coexist quite well. We'll see if that can remain the way here. Because you look at their 22, and you just look at the Jets in general, since Robert Saleh got there, they've been a mostly pass-happy team, 60%, 61, and 56% of the time, which you wouldn't think for a defensive-minded guy that would be the case. But you actually look at whenever Zach Wilson was not in the game, they averaged the most pass attempts and most pass yards in the league in those games across their last 2 years. So they love to throw the rock. It just was they would never throw it when Zach Wilson was there. So on that sense, you might think Aaron Rodgers is going to get heavily used and let's air it out and let's roll. They're going to do it with Flacco, and they're going to do that with Mike White. Why wouldn't you do it with Aaron Rodgers? But you also look at Nathaniel Hackett and Aaron Rodgers together. Maybe it was the LaFleur influence. Maybe it was Hackett. I don't know. But they were typically right around, you look at it, 57% pass, 43% run, 54%, 46%, 56, 42. So it's always kind of balanced attacks. They were always under the league average in plays run, kind of bleed the clock, take their time. It was never like a high-powered, let's let it rip with Hackett and Aaron Rodgers. It was always a methodical, good, solid offense that didn't end up lighting up the scoreboards, but they just won a lot of games because they really could control things. So that's kind of what I projected here is 59-41. So balancing that Jets run your pass happy ways with Hackett and Rodgers' history here to get a little bit below league average, minus 29. That's right around what we've seen there. So less total plays, but more likely some very efficient plays. Now, how will this all get distributed in this kind of meh overall pie? So starting with the pass catchers, this is going to be an easy one. And we saw this with Rodgers and Hackett's offense for 3 straight seasons with the Packers. And I think this Jets team is very similarly built to those Packers in that they're going to have an alpha, and then there's going to be very little else that you're really going to want to pay attention to. And I think that's going to be Garrett Wilson. I have him right now projected for 28% target share, which is not very many receivers break that 22%, never mind 28. But we saw Rodgers' number 1 receivers under Nathaniel Hackett. And yeah, it was Devontae Adams. I get that. So it's not just like this is automatically how they'll operate. But his average target share was 29.9% target share there. And even if you don't look at them and you go back to Jordy Nelson, you go back to Randall Cobb, his number 1 receiver has always averaged around 27.6% target share. So I thought 28% is honestly pretty fair, especially given that Rodgers is already comparing Devontae Adams and Garrett Wilson, saying I played with the number 17 that he reminds me of before. So I think 169 targets, 113 catches, and then he turns that into 1,424 yards and 11 touchdowns. I don't think that's actually as nearly as bold as some of you guys might think there. And a lot of you guys probably don't think it's bold. You're like, yeah, I get that. So even if you look at the averages for his wide receiver ones, whether you take Cobb, Nelson, Devontae Adams, Rodgers number one have averaged 102 catches, 1,215 yards, and 12 touchdowns. So this is right in line with their averages. This is me saying I think Garrett Wilson's better than what Randall Cobb used to be back in the day, and he's going to help balance that out. I really like this kid. So I love him. And then as you can see, after him, 73 for Lazard, 60 for Hardman, 50. None of these guys matter. Lazard's getting drafted way too early, in my opinion. I know he got recruited by Rodgers, but even in his year being Rodgers' number one, I can kind of show you real quick. Lazard's really done nothing in his career. He's a good blocker. He's a reliable guy. But fantasy-wise, his career high is 100 targets when he was the number one guy, 60, 46, and 52 otherwise. So 73 is breaking his historical trends. And that's while he's competing with Hardman. If Corey Davis stays, I don't love Corey Davis, but he's not any worse than Allen Lazard. So to me, Allen Lazard's the only one getting drafted right now. That makes no sense to me because the other guys aren't really getting drafted. It's the Garrett Wilson show. The only other pass catcher, except Breece Hall, which we'll make sure to cover. I've got a lot of points on him I want to talk about, and they're all good. Tyler Conklin, though, we haven't really seen a tight end thrive with Rodgers in a long, long time. They're typically around 10% or so target share guys. Conklin's been a 15% target share guy in back-to-back years. I think I put him in for 13%, which would be a little higher than what Rodgers typically targets tight ends, but also a little bit lower than what he's averaged these last few years, Tyler Conklin. And he was another one of those guys with or without Zach Wilson. He goes from averaging 6 points per game to averaging 9.5 points per game. At tight end, that is a significant jump up. 9.5 points would have put him right at the tight end 13, 14 range. And so it makes him at least a little bit more viable as a last round punt tight end in your underdog drafts. Could see him spiking a little bit more than what we've been accustomed to, just because he was pretty solid without Zach Wilson in those games. So 578, 5 touchdowns for him. Again, the rest of those guys mattering very little. But I did say I wanted to talk about Breece Hall. And if there's one thing that Nathaniel Hackett does well, it's involved his running backs in the passing game. I had some stats here over his last decade of calling plays here for Nathaniel Hackett. His teams have never, in 10 total years, never finished fewer than the top 10 in running back targets and target share other than one time. They've always finished with at least 103 total running back targets, and his top running back has had 63 or more targets in 7 of 9 years. Last year was one of those few years it didn't work out, but Javonte Williams got hurt. He was on pace for 89 targets last year. And I think Breece Hall as a receiver is better than anybody that Nathaniel Hackett's ever worked with. He is an insane receiver. That was one of his big calling cards coming out, was how good of a 3-down back he really is. So maybe he sacrifices a little bit of carry volume because it is usually a committee. You think of Aaron Jones and A.J. Dillon and Javonte Williams, Melvin Gordon. It's how he likes to operate his backfields. But the guy that's catching the passes is always going to have value here. So I have a nice 79 targets going to Breece Hall this year. And again, if he pierces 100, it wouldn't shock me. But around 60 catches on that, 413 receiving yards and 4 touchdowns to go with 1,000 yards and 7 TDs on the ground. That's a really solid season for Breece Hall, who's going late round 3 right now. It does assume that he's healthy and ready to start the year, which most reports say he will. This kid was a phenom last year, though. He only made it through a few games, but he was a running back one in over half of his games and only seemed to be picking up steam as the year went. So with more passing game work coming his way, and that's the natural skill set, I really like Breece Hall. Behind him, it's just going to be, I like this kid they drafted, Israel Nkanda. Michael Carter's had some flashes. I liked Zonovan Knight last year. So I think it's just going to be like a bunch of pretty good guys that just nibble at each other and don't matter outside of Breece Hall. And even if Breece Hall gets hurt, I think you're looking at a 2 to 3 headed committee that might get ugly. But yeah, Rodgers ultimately with all that comes out at 4,252 yards and 31 touchdowns to 9 interceptions. That would be more than, it might seem like a low amount for Aaron Rodgers. But if you look here,
seems high to me.
And honestly, that's kind of right where he's been. You pull it up here. So, oh no, that's running back one, not quarterback one. So you look at Aaron Rodgers here, and he hasn't thrown for that many yards. He's done that once in his last 5 years. So, it seems a little low, I guess, for the reigning MVP. The fact that he threw 48 touchdowns a few years ago, maybe there's some more meat on the bone. touchdowns wise with 31 versus 48, but I just don't like Nathaniel Hackett. I like these projections are pretty rosy. It wouldn't shock me at all if the Hackett just continues to combust. Rodgers is fed up. He's getting chewed out by the media, and this thing just combusts, and they are just horrible, and nobody performs well. Garrett Wilson runs one route the wrong way and gets frozen out. I don't think that happens, but I did want to just emphasize that floor does exist. There's a pretty big range of outcomes here for these Jets. So just keep that in mind too as you're drafting. There's really only Breece Hall and Garrett Wilson, and honestly, at their respective prices, like I typically you got to go Garrett Wilson or Devontae Adams. I'm just going to go Devontae Adams, who has a better track record. You typically go Breece Hall versus Ramondre Stevenson sometimes. I'll go Ramondre Stevenson in that case. So, yeah, I as much as I kind of like these guys, and I love those young two talents, I haven't ended up with a ton of them in early drafts right now.
I feel exactly the same way. And I said at the outset when we started talking about the Jets, I felt that Rodgers had about the widest range of possible outcomes for any quarterback in the league. It's possible there's somebody I'm not thinking of, but I mean, yeah, you can marry that to the Jets as a whole, and I mean, a lot of that will. I mean, God, there's so many question marks about everything, about everybody, from coaching to quarterback to running back to receiver. It's like you could see a real path to success. But man, I can see a rosy path to failure as well. So,
very much so.
That's about it.
What is up, you fantasy wolf? Thanks so much for tuning in. If you haven't already, share your thoughts in the comments, check out some more videos, and join the newest Wolfpack by subscribing below.